The night felt unnaturally calm when the news broke, as if the world itself had paused before delivering a blow it knew would never fully heal. A princess, more than a title, more than a face on glossy covers, was gone. Diana, the woman the world had crowned the Queen of Hearts, vanished in a single moment that official statements would later reduce to a cold phrase: a tragic car accident. Speed, loss of control, unavoidable impact. Simple words meant to close a chapter. Yet from the very first hours, another question began to echo far louder than the official explanation ever could. Was it truly an accident, or something far more carefully arranged? Paris awoke in mourning, but also in disbelief. The same cameras that had chased her smile, her compassion, her defiance of royal stiffness, now captured flowers piling up like silent accusations. Too many people felt that something about the story did not sit right. Diana had not been living quietly in the shadows. She had been stepping into a new phase of her life, one marked by independence, confidence, and a refusal to be controlled. She was no longer willing to be managed, reshaped, or silenced, and that, some believed, made her dangerous. In the weeks before her death, she spoke with a rare honesty. She talked about pressure, about fear, about the cost of living inside a system that valued appearance over truth. Her words, replayed after her passing, sounded less like reflections and more like warnings. Friends recalled her intuition, her sense that she was being watched, followed, boxed in. At the time, such feelings were dismissed as the natural anxiety of a woman constantly pursued by the media. After the crash, they took on a darker meaning. Questions began to surface almost immediately. Why that route through the tunnel? Why was the security detail so minimal for someone of her status? Why did the events of that night unfold with such devastating precision? Official investigations provided answers, but those answers felt incomplete, too neatly arranged. Each explanation seemed to close one door while opening three more, and the public, instead of finding closure, found itself sinking deeper into doubt. People who had never questioned authority before suddenly found themselves studying timelines, scrutinizing statements, replaying grainy footage. Diana was no longer just a victim of tragedy. She had become a symbol of everything hidden behind polished institutions and carefully crafted narratives. Her popularity had reached a level that eclipsed the very system she had once represented. She was loved not because of her crown, but because of her humanity, and that kind of influence is difficult to control. What unsettled many was the speed with which everything was wrapped up. Reports were filed, conclusions announced, and the world was gently encouraged to move on. But grief does not obey schedules, and suspicion does not vanish on command. Those who asked uncomfortable questions were met with silence, deflection, or polite dismissal. It felt as though the subject itself had become forbidden, as if continuing to look too closely risked exposing something no one wanted revealed. In London, the flowers did not stop coming. Letters filled with heartbreak, anger, and confusion lined the gates of palaces that suddenly seemed distant and cold. This was not just mourning, it was collective unease. People sensed that they had lost more than a beloved figure. They had lost the truth, or at least the chance to fully understand it. Diana's death had created a wound not only in the hearts of millions, but in their trust. Theories multiplied. Some argued that she threatened powerful interests. Others insisted that the truth lay not in a single grand scheme, but in a chain of decisions where convenience outweighed caution, where neglect became fatal. And then there were those who believed the most disturbing possibility of all, that the line between accident and intention was so thin it could no longer be seen. As years passed, one might have expected the questions to fade. Instead, they grew sharper. Diana's image only strengthened with time, her compassion echoing through charities, her story retold by generations who had never seen her alive. She became timeless, almost untouchable, and that endurance only deepened the mystery. If it was merely a tragic accident, why did it refuse to settle into history like other tragedies before it? Files remained sealed, testimonies remained contested, and time, so often a healer, refused to erase the doubt. New voices, younger and more distant from the emotion of that night, began asking the same questions with fresh eyes. They saw patterns where others had seen chaos, silences where others had heard explanations. Diana's story seemed to resist a final period, insisting instead on a question mark. Perhaps the most unsettling thought is that the full truth, whatever it may be, is deeply uncomfortable. Because if her death was not simply a matter of chance, then it suggests a world where influence outweighs innocence, where love from the public is not protection but a liability. And in that realization, the story becomes larger than Diana herself. It becomes a reflection of power, fear, and control. Somewhere between official reports and public memory lies a space filled with unanswered questions. It is there, in that quiet gap, that her story continues to breathe. And as attention slowly turns toward the final hours before everything changed, toward the private conversations, the subtle warnings, and one seemingly ordinary decision made late at night, the narrative begins to narrow, focusing on a moment that appeared insignificant at the time but may have carried irreversible consequences, because it was precisely then, just before the city lights blurred into motion, that events were set in motion in a way no one could undo, and the truth began to slip further into the shadows, waiting for someone brave enough to follow it into the darkness where the tunnel ahead seemed ordinary, almost forgettable, a stretch of concrete passed through by thousands of cars every night without incident. Yet that night, it became a threshold. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was tense but deceptively calm, the kind of calm that arrives just before something irreversible happens. Laughter had faded, replaced by distraction, by glances at passing lights, by the hum of the engine echoing against the walls. Outside, unseen eyes followed the movement, some driven by curiosity, others perhaps by purpose, though no one inside the car could have known which was which. Moments before entering the tunnel, time appeared to compress. Decisions were made quickly, almost casually, without any sense of consequence. A turn taken, a speed adjusted, a route accepted without question. These choices, insignificant on any other night, suddenly carried weight far beyond their appearance. Later, analysts would dissect these seconds frame by frame, wondering how such ordinary actions could align so perfectly with disaster. After the impact, chaos followed, but even chaos seemed strangely controlled. Sirens arrived, barriers were raised, cameras were pushed back. Information emerged slowly and selectively, as if filtered through an invisible hand. Those first reports shaped everything that followed, fixing the narrative before questions had time to form. By the time the world woke up, the story had already been written in firm, official language that left little room for doubt, or so it claimed. But doubts are stubborn things. They creep into the smallest cracks. Medical timelines were debated, emergency response procedures examined, witness statements compared and recompared. Some accounts conflicted subtly, others sharply, yet few of these contradictions ever reached the headlines. Instead, they circulated quietly, shared in whispers, in documentaries aired late at night, in books that were praised by some and dismissed by others as speculation. One of the most unsettling aspects was how predictable everything seemed in retrospect. The absence of certain safeguards, the presence of unusual circumstances, the convergence of pressure, pursuit, and vulnerability. Diana had been many things, compassionate, rebellious, empathetic, but above all, she was visible. Her visibility gave her power, and power, even when unintentional, invites resistance. The more she stepped beyond her prescribed role, the more she challenged expectations that had been carefully preserved for generations. Those close to her spoke of change. She was planning, dreaming, imagining a future that did not revolve around palaces or protocols. She wanted to redefine herself on her own terms, and in doing so, she disrupted an equilibrium that relied on predictability. Whether this disruption was enough to provoke something darker remains unanswered, but the timing of her death continues to fuel speculation. Investigations came and went, each one promising clarity, each one delivering conclusions that felt oddly restrained. Language mattered. Words like unavoidable, unfortunate, and tragic appeared frequently, while others, those that suggested intent or negligence, were carefully avoided. To some, this caution seemed responsible. To others, it felt deliberate. Public memory refused to align neatly with official findings. People remembered Diana not as a distant royal figure, but as a woman who hugged strangers, who knelt to meet children at eye level, who touched the untouchable. That emotional connection made it impossible for many to accept a version of events that reduced her death to bad luck and bad timing. Emotion, after all, does not accept footnotes and appendices. As years turned into decades, new information surfaced, not enough to rewrite history, but enough to disturb its surface. Former officials spoke vaguely of pressure. Associates hinted at concerns that had never been formally recorded. Small details, overlooked or dismissed in the past, were suddenly re-examined through a modern lens. Technology advanced, perspective shifted, and the story gained new layers rather than losing relevance. What makes the mystery endure is not just the unanswered questions, but the pattern of silence around them. Silence from institutions, from those who might know more than they can say, from files that remain closed long after curiosity has turned into suspicion. Silence can be protective, but it can also be revealing, especially when it surrounds an event that changed the emotional landscape of an entire generation. Diana's legacy complicates everything. She is remembered not only for how she died, but for how she lived, and that life continues to cast a shadow over the circumstances of her death. Every charitable act, every recorded smile, every moment of vulnerability adds weight to the idea that her story deserved more transparency than it received. The stronger her legacy grows, the harder it becomes to ignore the unresolved nature of her final hours. Perhaps the truth exists not as a single revelation, but as a mosaic of moments, each one incomplete on its own. A decision here, an omission there, a delay, a pursuit, a fear unspoken. None of these elements alone prove anything, yet together they form an image that is difficult to dismiss entirely. The line between coincidence and design becomes blurred, not erased, leaving room for interpretation that refuses to settle. And so the question remains alive, passed from one generation to the next, reshaped by new voices and new doubts. What happened in that tunnel was more than an accident in the eyes of many. It was a convergence of forces that had been building quietly, invisibly, long before the car ever began its final journey. To understand it fully, one must look not only at that night, but at everything that led up to it, at the pressures, the conflicts, the fears, and the quiet warnings that were never meant for public ears, because somewhere within those overlooked details lies a thread that, if pulled just a little harder, might begin to unravel a version of events the world was told to accept, and as attention shifts closer to that fragile thread, the story narrows again, drawing us deeper into the moments just before everything slipped beyond control, when one final choice lingered in the air, waiting to be made, and no one yet realized how much depended on it, because that was the instant when. In the end, the power of this story does not come from proving one version of events over another, but from understanding why the question itself refuses to disappear. Princess Diana's death marked more than the loss of a beloved public figure. It marked the moment when millions realized that truth, especially when wrapped in power and prestige, is rarely simple. The tunnel in Paris became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of uncertainty, an unlit space where official explanations and human intuition collide. What makes this mystery endure is the emotional weight Diana carried into the world. She was not distant or untouchable. She was visibly human in a role designed to be distant and controlled. People saw themselves in her struggles, her kindness, her rebellion against cold tradition. When someone like that dies suddenly, without clarity that feels satisfying or complete, the mind naturally searches for meaning beyond chance. An accident feels too small an answer for a loss that felt so enormous. Time has passed, but time has not softened the questions. If anything, it has sharpened them. Distance allows reflection without shock, and reflection often reveals patterns missed in the moment. The more Diana's life is studied, the clearer it becomes that she was standing at a crossroads, between duty and freedom, between expectation and independence. Whether or not that crossroads played a role in her death remains unproven, but it undeniably shapes how the world interprets her final chapter. There is also an uncomfortable truth that many prefer not to face. Systems rarely admit their own fragility. Institutions are built on continuity, on stability, on the idea that nothing truly threatens their foundations. Diana challenged that simply by being herself. Her popularity did not belong to protocol, it belonged to people. And when love flows outside official channels, it can become unsettling for those who rely on control rather than connection. Yet it is important to remember that mystery does not always mean conspiracy, just as accident does not always mean innocence. Reality often exists in the space between extremes. A chain of human decisions, each flawed but not malicious on its own, can still lead to irreversible consequences. In that sense, the tragedy may not lie in a single hidden hand, but in a collective failure to protect someone who had already given so much of herself to the world. What cannot be denied is that Diana's death exposed something raw and lasting. It exposed how deeply people crave transparency, how instinctively they resist narratives that feel incomplete. It showed that public trust, once shaken, does not return easily. And it proved that a story left unresolved becomes more powerful than one neatly explained. Diana's legacy continues to grow precisely because her story remains open. She is remembered not for fear, but for compassion, not for secrecy, but for warmth. That contrast fuels the unease. A woman who lived so openly did not receive an ending that felt equally open, and that imbalance continues to echo through time. Each new documentary, each rediscovered interview, each quiet admission adds another layer, not to the answer, but to the question. Perhaps the greatest impact of her death is the mirror it holds up to society. It asks whether we are willing to accept official truth without emotional truth. It asks how easily we trade understanding for closure. And it asks whether remembering someone means honoring not just the facts of their death, but the spirit of their life. In the silence left behind, Diana still speaks, not through secrets, but through influence. Charities inspired by her work continue. Stories of her kindness still circulate. Young people who never saw her alive still feel they know her. That kind of presence does not fade, and it does not belong to history alone. It belongs to conscience. So whether her death was a tragic accident, a series of fatal misjudgments, or something darker that will never be fully revealed, one truth stands unshaken. Princess Diana mattered. She mattered enough for the world to keep asking. She mattered enough for doubt to survive decades. And she mattered enough that her final moments are still examined not out of obsession, but out of love and longing for honesty. Maybe the mystery remains because it is meant to. Not to torment, but to remind. To remind us that behind titles are people, behind headlines are lives, and behind official endings there can exist unanswered truths. And as long as those truths remain just out of reach, the story of Princess Diana will never truly close. It will live on as a question written into history, urging each generation to look deeper, feel more, and never stop asking whether what we are told is always all there is.